6'6" above sea level. I grab the mic because I like to take you to another mental level. Low power frequency radio modulation. The big sound from underground. We bring the truth to places truth is never heard before.
Well, hey everyone, you're listening to A Public Affair on WORT 89.9 FM. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I'm hosting today's episode. Alan will be back next week. Today we're talking with you about the war in Ukraine. If you would like to join the conversation, give us a call at 608-256-2001, extension 9. You can also tweet us at WORT Talk or reach out to A Public Affair on Facebook. And today I'm going to be your host and I'm going to be your guest. Actually, the guest hopefully will be you. So I'm looking forward to answering your questions and hearing your comments about what is going on in Ukraine, and perhaps Russia is also part of this unfortunate equation. Just a couple of words about me. I'm originally from Russia. I was born in Moscow, Russia. I've been in the United States for over 30 years. I came here as a child. Actually, I was 13, so I came with my parents. Got education at the University of Utah first. I got my bachelor's degree in musical composition. How does that work? And then I got my master's degree at UW-Whitewater in mass communication. And I host a Rashkin Report channel that is specializing in doing interviews with influencers in Russia and in Ukraine and all over the world, because Russian speakers now, most of the ones that dare to speak, they don't live in Russia anymore. So and that led me to being invited to as a guest commenter on all sorts of Ukrainian TV and YouTube channels. So these days I hear sometimes once a day, sometimes more than that, from different news outlets who want to understand a little bit better about American perspective on what is going on in Ukraine. Believe it or not, there's a lot of disinformation. There's a lot of people who are trying to spread information that the United States is not really supporting Ukraine and that Ukraine should go and handle Vladimir Putin on its own, which means go and agree to whatever Vladimir Putin has to say. This is obviously not correct. But the information is out there, and I would very much like to hear from you, and your thoughts and comments are because, as I'd like to share with you what I know, and I'd like to take the information that you share with me back to the Ukrainian news outlets. It's very interesting because sometimes they will lose electricity in the middle of an interview, and sometimes they have to leave the building, and just kind of roll with it because that's how war is. And there's also at the same time a tremendous amount of news that is breaking like literally today that has to do with Russia and Ukraine. So, for instance, one of the just today, President Biden announced that WNBA star Brittany Griner was released through prisoner exchange, and she will be coming back to the United States, and that's really exciting news. If you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear from you. The number, of course, is 608-256-2001, extension 9. The person that was traded for Brittany Griner was not, it seems like when we talk about basketball, it seems like there's a trade, a basketball player for basketball player. But in this case, we have a basketball player for an arms dealer because Viktor Anatolievich But is a Russian arms dealer, an entrepreneur, and former Soviet military translator. He used his multiple companies to smuggle weapons since the collapse of the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe to Africa and the Middle East during the 90s and early 2000s. He's been arrested in 2008 in Thailand on terrorism charges, and he's been serving time here one way or another since 2011. The matter of his return and exchange was discussed for a long time, and finally it seems like a compromise was reached that is acceptable both to the administration and to Kremlin. And it's interesting and telling that we are exchanging a person who is, accomplished athlete in exchange for an arms dealer. But those are the values, and those are that's something else that I wanted to kind of run dear listeners of WORT, and get your thoughts on as well. So Victor Bout in exchange for Brittany Griner. Now, there's at least two other people who are citizens of the United States who are still in Russian jails at this time, one of whom is Paul Whelan, and they were not part of this particular trade. And that brings us to really the other news, which is that United States appointed a new ambassador to Russia, who is formerly ambassador to Armenia. Now it's Lynn Tracy. And Lynn Tracy is a scholar of Russia, and perhaps out there in the audience we have somebody who knows Lynn Tracy and would like to share her, your perspective with us on her appointment. I will say that from her remarks, she is looking for ways to really help support people of Russia, because building relationship with Kremlin is not really, I don't think, objective right now, other than to perhaps avoid nuclear war. But the two issues, which is one, getting American citizens out of Russian jails, and really helping people of Russia promote the relationship between America and the people of Russia. Those appear to be two of Lynn Tracy's objectives as the new ambassador. So those are, I think, are very interesting topic. And, what do you think about what should be our relationship with Russia? Because European Union has just passed, decree announcing that Russia is now a state sponsor of terrorism. We here in the United States have not done this at this point. Now, there could be diplomatic reasons why this hasn't been done. What do you think? Should we declare Russia to be a state sponsor of terrorism? And to what extent these kinds of formulas are relevant, considering that that we are helping Ukraine defend itself, and to what extent those types of names are relevant and important in order to get us and all the allies to be able to help Ukraine achieve its victory. So there's at least two bits of information that I think are important and relevant to our conversation. What has been happening in Ukraine is, I think many of you have been following right on your television sets or your smartphones, because we do have a lot of information available, and we see that while the Russian army is not able to destroy and show its supposed might on the battlefield, the joke goes that formerly known as the second biggest, strongest army in the world, Russia is now the second strongest army in Ukraine. So they're not doing so well, but they're still, when people refer to Russian army as a meat grinder and cannon fodder, it's almost literally true, because the number of losses that Russia has sustained has always been great in all wars. Those that are interested in history may recall that in World War II, Russia lost millions and millions of people. But when we look at how they're fighting, it seems easy to imagine how misuse what we consider to be very valuable resource, and how it is not considered valuable resource in Russia. And that's actually one of the things that I think is very important to point out, that when we hear about the democracies and autocracies, one of the features of it's not just whether we elect our leaders, it's also about what I call virtue of ethics of virtue versus ethics of strength. And what I mean by that is that we in the West tend to follow a set of principles, ethical principles, that perhaps incorporate Immanuel Kant and his categorical imperative, where we do not want to do to others things that we don't want done to us. We want to do the right thing. We measure people by whether they're able to, trying to, successful at doing the right thing. On the other hand, a different system of values would say that you can do whatever you are strong enough to do. If you are strong enough to do it, well, then you can. Then you decide if you want to do it or not. And if you are not able to do it, then it's just not an option. And that is something that I think is very helpful in kind of opening the can here and seeing what feeds this kind of imperial, as is often referred to, Russian attempt at expansion of its empire. We can talk about the historical narrative, but I find it interesting that it really depends on who you talk to. If you speak to Russians, or if you speak to people from Ukraine, or if you speak to Americans, frankly, because there's three distinctly different perspectives. From Russian point of view, Russian people point of view, they didn't feel like they were involved in the decision-making process, and so they don't want to necessarily be responsible for what is happening. And they were certainly not thinking that they were going to be mobilized and brought onto the field of battle and expected to take a part. They were more than willing to sit by their televisions and cheer on their murderous army, but when they were ordered to now support their army, they went, no, no, no. And that actually is creating a lot of interesting moments, because we see a lot of Russian men in particular run away from Russia, but just because they ran away from Russia doesn't mean that they support Ukraine, doesn't mean that they're opposed to Putin's regime. They just went, no, 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 we don't want this. We are strong enough to run away, and that's what we're going to do. So, to what extent Russian people are supporting the war in Ukraine, which they're still forbidden from calling a war, is questionable, because it is impossible to do sociological studies in a fascist country during the time of war and expect the results to be reliable. We have a lot of this during Soviet Union. People would judge of what was going on in Soviet Union by looking at who was staying on Lenin's mausoleum during parades, who was closest to the Secretary General, who was further away, and we're almost reduced to that level of understanding what is going on in Russia. In Ukraine, there's a vibrant democracy. There's a president who was elected, who's done, on one hand, a masterful job of rallying Ukrainians to the cause, and in my opinion, has been linchpin for Ukraine's resistance. It is incredibly important to have the captain of the ship remain the ship. It's not just a kind of a legend and good manners to go down with the ship. This is also just good policy. And what we saw with Zelensky is that he is sticking around. He's stuck around, and he is leading the charge back. He's going to cities that have been just recently liberated. Unlike Putin, who is out there, on doing publicity stunts. So it is very interesting. But we have a question from Ken from Madison. I love questions. In your perspective, what's going on in Ukraine concerning Nazis? It seems like there's lots of misinformation out there. All right. Absolutely. Let's hit on that. So there's been some accusations thrown around as part of the general Russian whataboutism. Which if you can look it up, and it's when you say something to old story, is that you would say, well, Russia does all these things terrible, and they would say, well, look in America, look at all the things you're doing wrong. And so now we're defending ourselves instead of talking about the issue, which is what is going on and the original point. So bringing up Nazis and the idea that Putin started the war with on 24th of February, the big open war, because the war has been, of course, going on since 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. But the big open war was started with his slogan to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, which, of course, is really what Russia needs, is to be denazified, demilitarized, and probably deassembled. But projection is a powerful tool to understand what people are speaking about. If you look at Ukrainian politics, you will see that extremists have not done well in elections there. They are absolutely marginal in the society, and the president of Ukraine is Jewish. So to accuse Ukraine of having Nazi past, yes, there were collaborants on all sides during World War II. And moreover, some of my relatives left Ukraine to avoid anti-Semitism. And that's where I say, apparently things have changed, because when I lived in Soviet Union and when my relatives were living in Ukraine, when it was still part of Russian Empire, there was no way that a Jewish person would be in charge of Ukraine, whether it was part of Russia or whether it is a separate country. It's not imaginable. So I think it is important to acknowledge that things apparently change. And right now, when we hear those kinds of statements about Nazis in Ukraine, we just need to look at who the sources are. By the way, if you ever see RT on your screen, if it hasn't been blocked by YouTube, just remember that providing information is not the goal of Russian media outlets. It's never been. Their goal is to provide a point of view, propaganda. We in the West have this, we are, how do I say, we have news information, news media corporations that know that by telling us all sorts of bad things, they're not going to sell a lot of advertisements. It's a legitimate capitalist problem. And so on some level, it's refreshing to see a news outlet or outlets that will say about things that are wrong and point out things. But at the same time, we have to go, okay, so advertisements are not paying for this. Who is paying for this? Where's the money coming from to pay for this kind of information? Well, it comes from people that really don't wish us very well. And that's what is providing for them, like the incentive. We've seen obviously Russian involvement in 2016 in our elections. And now we have seen Putin's man known as his chef, who has since become the man in charge of running his private army, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who announces that Russia was getting involved in American elections, is and will be. Of course, it obviously creates good opportunities for prosecutors of International Court in Hague to build case against Mr. Prigozhin, since he's so obviously stating that, this would be for the United States, but he's also taking responsibility for crimes that he's committing in Ukraine because they are projecting strength. They're showing that they're strong. And when we look at how different Russia and Ukraine are what they're expressing sorrow about, I think it's very telling, because Ukrainians are they miss every person, every man, woman, child that has been murdered in this murderous war. Russians tend to miss the equipment that they lost, because the equipment is hard to get. It has to be built. Human life generally has very, very little value. And that is very important for us to understand when we think about what is the effective ways of defending ourselves against that really corrupting influence. And I will remind you that you're listening to A Public Affair on WORT 89.9 FM. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I'm hosting today's episode. We're talking to you today about the war in Ukraine. If you would like to join the conversation, give us a call at 608-256-2001, extension 9, and would love to hear from you. Yes. So we have the American perspective as well, don't we? And the American perspective is that we are supporting democratic countries. We're supporting countries solving, we're not. This is one of the things that Russians are curious about. If they've been told that they're not fighting with Ukraine, they're really fighting with NATO. They're really fighting with the U.S. because all this help that the U.S. is providing to Ukraine is equal to U.S. being part of the war. To which I kind of explained that if U.S. was really involved, this would have been over long ago. So we're dealing with Ukrainians actually who right now are very concerned about our weapons. They want more weapons. They want better weapons. They want more powerful weapons. And they're trying to figure out why. Why are we not sending them all the weapons that they're asking for if we say that we're supporting them? Are we trying to strain them along so they don't quite lose but don't quite win? What is the secret conspirological plan that we are really hiding right here that will help understand what's going on? And so part of what I do is I explain that has to be funding Funding has to be turned into production. Production has to result in weapons. Weapons have to be not just shipped, but people who are using those weapons have to be trained. People who are servicing those weapons have to know how to service them. This is a big, long process, and we're engaged in this process, but it doesn't happen overnight. And that's one of the challenges and one of the things that are very interesting to people in Ukraine. At the same time, of course, looking at an American perspective as well, we have been quite open about opening our doors to refugees. Myself, I came as part of Soviet Jews who came mostly during 1970s, 1980s, and there was a different policy then that stopped when Soviet Union fell apart. But currently, we're allowing Ukrainians into the country with a sponsor. And what do you think about this? Do you think this is a good idea? We should do more of this, less of this? We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, we have Joan from Madison who's on the line. Joan, welcome to the program.
Hi, Yuri. Thanks for this program. I've got a question for you. I've heard from a friend who's traveled in the area that there's 100,000 Russian men in Belgrade, and they are estimating that there's 1 million Russian men have left Russia and gone into the surrounding countries, and there's 1 million of them. And I'm wondering if this is true.
It's one of those things where
I'll go off the air.
Was it okay?
Thanks.
Thank you, Joan, for the question. I think it's great. I think it's been a really interesting thing that I've heard from a lot of my American friends about what is going on with Russian men running away and how many of them. I think that we don't truly understand the scope of this other than to say that there's far more men that have left Russia than is the number that Putin supposedly wanted to mobilize in the first place. So people decided this Russian roulette, rim shot, people decided they didn't like their chances. They prefer their chances to get out. And then it just depends on which border is closest to them and how are those different countries responding to them. Because some of the countries of the former Soviet Union, such as Georgia, have been, they took in a lot of Russians, Russian men in particular, and they now are living in nearly everywhere in kind of a refugee situation where people are renting rooms, people are renting in rooms. It seems like a very temporary Band-Aid kind of a solution, and it's really important to see if this is going to be a long-term or a short-term. And then people who run away from Russia, they never quite know, those that want to come back, if this is going to be a long-term or a short-term, because in Russia you can never predict. But there's certainly hundreds of thousands of Russian men who are in Eastern Europe, who are in Kazakhstan, who are in Georgia, and in different countries, they're treated differently. And on some level, I gotta say, I find this to be kind of ironic, because one of the important traits of Russians that is a kind of a negative trait is a sense of condescending to others. Like we are Russians, we have this great culture, which is, there's, I don't know, everybody's got literature and music, but Russian culture somehow is greater than all others. And so there's this habit of looking down at others. I think it also is bred by kind of lack of power, that on that ethics, on that ladder of ethics, being in Russia and Russian is not the strongest, place. So if you can look down at somebody, that kind of strengthens who you are as a person, I guess. And now we're seeing all of these people who are running away, and now they're on the position of illegal immigrants. Now they're the ones who are illegal laborers in all of these countries. And I don't wish anybody ill will except for Vladimir Putin and his ilk and his junta. But it is a powerful lesson of, when we're placed in the shoes of other people. So I hope that there will be some lessons that will be learned out of this. But who knows? So that is a kind of that is one way to answer Joanne's question. And I hope that there's others who have questions as well. We are spending a tremendous amount of money in Ukraine. What do you think? Does it matter? Because from the point of view of Ukrainians, who cares about money? We're being bombed right now. It's not about money. Let's take care of the military problem first. And that is not necessarily how we may look at something like this from a democratic point of view, where we are taxpayers and our tax dollars are being spent for whatever the whatever the government does. It is something that is financed by our tax dollars. How do we feel about this? That is not really a mindset that is too familiar to Ukrainians, and certainly not very familiar to Russians, where people live kind of at the mercy of the government. And actually, one of the problems there is that one of the critical linchpins of Communist Party, but also what we see now with Putin's rule, is really pushing people away from self-governance, pushing people away from taking charge of their communities, of their lives, of anything that we can do, that we organize ourselves, is seen as a threat. Even something like there was to commemorate victory in World War II, there was a parade of people spontaneously occurring, essentially, was created by a couple of journalists, where people would walk around and march with pictures of their relatives who passed. This was a nice organic action, and then it outgrew because government took it over, and now we have people who are walking around with pictures of Stalin and his criminal gang. So, but it's been taken over by government. So people are in kind of over and over. This type of behavior reduces folks to understanding that if there is a problem, then somebody else should be fixing it, because it's not up to me, because I'm nobody to fix this, and I don't want to get this started because it's not going to end well. So it's a different mindset. But we have a caller, David. David, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us.
Hi, Yuri. Thank you for your program. My name is David Williams. I coordinate the Peregrine Forum in Madison, and I've been a lifelong opponent of U.S. imperialism since being involved in the Vietnam anti-war movement at UW back in the day. Here's my comment. There are many people on the American left, and my sisters and brothers in the Madison left and peace movement, who, are also opponents of U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism has committed, enormous crimes, wars of foreign occupation, genocides, etc. That said, the opposition to NATO or opposition to U.S. imperialism shouldn't compel us to want to throw the Ukrainians under Putin's bus, because Putin's mafia state is also an imperialist power and has committed tremendous crimes in places like Syria and Chechnya. So I feel that Ukraine is caught between these two competing imperialist blocs and is fighting for its survival. And as a democratic socialist, I think the only possibility for the people of Ukraine and the working class who are taking the brunt of this terrible war to eventually survive as a sovereign people, and to then carry out a program of social reform and ultimately to turn Ukraine into a socialist democracy. That's not going to happen if we throw the Ukrainians under Putin's bus. So I want to thank you for your program, and I hope that a lot of people in the Madison left and the peace movement take these ideas to heart. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
David, thank you so much for your call. And you're not seeing me, but I'm sitting here nodding my head to a lot of what you're saying, because it is so important to say that, because we're dealing with, on one hand, an imperialist state, which is Russia. And we're dealing with United States, which has a history of being involved in wars that are, to put it lightly, have been questionable. And I think that left a terrible taste in people's mouth, mine included. I mean, I've seen, I haven't seen Vietnam, but I've seen Iraq, and it was the idea that we can go somewhere and we can create democracy while pointing a gun at somebody's head, those are just crazy ideas. Democracy is something that is built by people on the inside by themselves through self-governance. But at the same time, United States doesn't just, our imperial influence doesn't just go through our weapons. It also goes through our economics, right? Economic imperialism. And that is where it's very important that the aid that we are right now providing Ukraine is done not as a credit, because it's great that we passed Lend-Lease and we're able to provide like land and lease weapons to Ukraine if necessary, but it is so much better than we're doing this right now, because when the war is over, Ukraine should have a chance, rather than being completely buried in debt, to be able to have a chance to grow its own state and economy without being shackled economically by the West. There's a difference between being an ally, being a trade partner, being all of those things, and being completely controlled either militarily or economically. And I think it's really important that we remember and make sense of lessons of the past and understand that Ukraine is not Iraq, Ukraine is not Afghanistan. Ukraine is a country that has created its own, that has a democratically elected leader, and this is a country that is defending itself. And I think that while that we just need to keep those differences in mind. But I very much agree with a lot of the things you said, David. Thank you so much. Let's see. We had a listener from South America and asked, why did Ukraine vote with the U.S. against Cuba? Wow, that is going outside of my scope of expertise. I will have to do some more research on that and find out. But I think that Ukraine. By the way, it's not the Ukraine. This is language lessons. We tend to sometimes not think about it and say Ukraine, the Ukraine. Those little things matter for Ukrainians a lot. There's actually in Russian, there's a difference between if you say on Ukraine or in Ukraine, and in Ukraine means that you acknowledge that it's a separate country. And if you say on Ukraine, then that means that you are thinking that or Ukraine is part of something. So language has been changing in how people think about things. So it's been just a tremendous leap that we have all made in since the 24th of February in particular. I'll remind you that you're listening to A Public Affair on WORT 89.9 FM. My name is Yuri Rashkin. I'm hosting today's episode. Alan will be back next week. Today we're talking with you about the war in Ukraine. If you would like to join the conversation, please give us a call at 608-256-2001, extension 9. To continue, a couple of other things that I wanted to relay to you. There's how can we help Ukraine? It's a good question, and I always want to make sure to include solutions because there are certainly problems, there are certainly causes, but there's always solutions. And there's different ways we can mail things. I've mailed some things that people have gathered, and it went to a specific place of some relative that I have who was running a refugee center in Ukraine. But we can send humanitarian supplies. We can join a protest in our city. We can host Ukrainians, and we can hire Ukrainians. There's actually organizations in Madison that deal with refugee resettlement. So we can volunteer or help professionally. Perhaps this is something that would be interesting to you, dear WORT listener, because we know that WORT functions in huge part because of volunteers. So perhaps this is another cause that you may want to consider contributing your time and energy at the same time as well. And of course, donate. In some ways, all causes have a lot of similarities, but nonetheless, real ways we can help Ukraine. We have Morris from Madison who asks, how much does Yuri know about the relationship between Trump and Putin? Is Trump complicit? Does Russia have compromise on him? What can I say about that wonderful, wonderful, wonderful topic? It's been shown over and over, and now we're likely to have kind of official proof of this through Donald Trump's tax returns that Congress has finally been able to get their hands on, is that a lot of his money, his wealth for his overpriced real estate came from Russia. When he said, I don't know any Russians, that was the farthest thing from the truth, because he knows a lot of Russians. He sold a lot of real estate to a lot of Russians, and they overpaid tremendous tens of millions of dollars for some of his real estate. And to me, it doesn't require, receipt from Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump saying money received, services provided. That we're dealing on slightly different level here. But it is important to acknowledge, first of all, that Donald Trump was willing to, basically, he was doing everything that Vladimir Putin wanted him to do. Whether there's been some statements made that, when Trump was in power, there was no war. Well, when Trump was in power, he was busy destroying NATO and making our allies feel like the United States was not going to be there for them. He was creating the foundation for what was going to happen in the second he was thinking going to be his second term. But I always sent people to the 2018 meeting in Helsinki in Finland, because that is just so it was so visually. We could tell the relationship, the power, the ethic of strength, again, between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. We could tell who was the banker, and we could tell who was the borrower. Now, at this point, the thing that worries me besides Donald Trump getting elected is the misinformation that is being spread in Ukraine, where people are being told that the Biden administration is trying to sell Ukraine out. That really, it is Donald Trump that is the real friend of Ukraine, and he's the real enemy of Putin. And when people would say, but, Donald Trump just had a dinner with a Nazi and a fascist, is that anything important to pay attention to? They would say, well, but his wife is married to a Jewish person. How can you say that? So some of those things and some of those tropes we have seen over and over. But the relationship between Putin and Trump at this point is, for better or for worse, very well documented. I will also recommend a book called American Compromise that is co-written by Yuri Shvets, or at least he's used as one of the main sources for the part about the relationship between Putin and Trump. And there's just a list of connections. But I think if you look at the actions, this is one of the things we hear over and over. Don't listen to the words, look at the actions. And Donald Trump's actions have been very, very friendly to Putin. And in fact, it is one of the qualities, I understand, of the code working for those kinds of outfits like FSB is not to say anything bad about Putin. And so when we have these people who are just turning themselves into pretzels to avoid saying anything bad about Vladimir Putin, it's just remarkable. It's just remarkable because to me, that is such a giveaway. That is such a giveaway. I'll remind everyone that you're listening to WORT, Public Affair. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I'm super excited to be hosting today's episode. I'm very grateful to the calls that we have had so far and questions that we've had so far. Great. I love WORT listeners. And we have another one on the line. I hope I'm not going to regret what I just said. Sarah, welcome to the program.
I'm calling from New York State. I think that Biden had to make a very tough decision about trading Brittany Griner for an arms dealer. I think he was pressured from all sides because there was a man who had been a political prisoner in Russia for at least, I'm pretty sure, 4 years, and he could have been traded. So I'm wondering, my question is, what would you do if you, meaning anyone else, do in this situation? Would you pardon? Would you get Brittany out, or would you get this man who's been in for 4 years? Thank you very much.
Sarah, that is a really great question. Thank you so much for the call. And I think that we see kind of a balance of here between national security and to extent to which releasing somebody like Victor Bout harms our national security. And I would think that if he was allowed to leave, that means that the risk has been managed. And he has spent several years in prison. So this was not an easy decision, but it is a strong decision, really, that was made. At the same time, human life, sanctity of human life, not like the choice really issue, but the sanctity of people who were born and are living right now, is a huge priority. And I think that's really encouraging. And when President Biden in his announcement says at the same time that, please, American citizens, look at the State Department warnings about countries you may want to travel to, because that may not be a good idea to travel to, let's say, Russia, because Brittany Griner she had vaping capsules and she got 9 years in Russian jail, which is not just this is how they deal with drugs. This is how they deal with Brittany Griner. One of classic Russian expressions is that law is there, but you got to find the person. Like we have laws for everything, but you got to find the person that you apply the law to. So in this case, Brittany Griner turned out to be first, an example of how cruel they can be, and then she was finally released. And I think that while pressured, I don't know that there's too much choice, because Biden administration said already that they were willing to talk to Russia only about how to get those people out of Russian jails. So I would say, if you don't want to be exchanged for the next Victor Bout, then consider heeding warning of State Department on travel as well, because flying through Russia, even right now. I mean, Mikhail Baryshnikov, a famous ballet dancer that many of you have heard, I suspect, said that he always watched where his flight were headed because he would never fly over Russia. So, and when we saw that a few months ago, or maybe a year ago now, Belarus dictator Lukashenko even insisted he landed a plane that was flying over Belarus, and he insisted the plane land, and because he was trying to get to a reporter, and he arrested the reporter, and the reporter is still in Belarus. It puts a kind of a whole different level of responsibility on us to think about our travel plans. It's crazy, but that's the world we live in right now. All right. Thank you, Sarah. And Tom is on the line. Tom, welcome to the program.
Yes, hi. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the Azov regiment.
Sure.
The right-wing neo-Nazi group.
Yeah, that's great. See, this is where the disinformation and misinformation continues to thrive. It's interesting because Azov they've been heroes of Mariupol. They've been heroes to Ukraine, and nobody there talks about Azov as being a Nazi outfit. I think they had some leadership, or years ago, some people who had those kinds of attitudes. They're not involved with it for years, and Azov is, when you look at people how do you fight disinformation and misinformation? With information, look at the specific people. There's stories of Azov fighters. There's a musician. There's just not that musicians couldn't be bad people. So there's certainly a lot that can be said that Azov is not Nazis, but I will cut to the chase and say that if somebody is telling you that Azov fighters are Nazis, then that you're being misinformed. You're being disinformed, and I would pay attention to the information diet and where you're getting the information. Because there's nothing more atrocious and terrible than Nazis and fascists, and that's why I don't go to Russia anymore. Let's say we have, We have another caller, Nino. Oh, Nino, do I know you? Welcome to the program.
Yuri, how are you?
Doing
Listen,
great.
you're doing a wonderful job. And, in all my travels, I actually had been behind the Iron Curtain in 83 when Andropov was in charge, and then went back in 88, 89, 90, 91. Spent time in the Baltics when they were in revolt, and then also Ukraine and in Poland and in East Germany. And your depiction of Trump and Putin is right on. And even though the old Soviet fell in 91, the fact of the matter is KGB is still in charge. My question to you is, what kind of pressure can we put on the White House and Congress and NATO to do a Berlin airlift for Ukraine for humanitarian reasons only? Because Putin is doing exactly what Khrushchev and others try to do when they wanted to isolate and starve out Western Berlin. And if we do that, I think that puts pressure on Putin, even though there may be a risk. But as long as it's humanitarian aid only, it's another move in this chess game.
Nino, that's a great point. And I think we just need to remember the whole world looks up to us because we're Americans and we live in America. And all the things we might know about how imperfect our country is, people still look up to us to be the decision and the difference makers in this world. And when we abstragate from our responsibility by not voting, by not speaking out, by not contacting our elected officials, we are giving up our power that we do have. And so I think it's really important. I have a friend who says that it's more important to send a nightly email to Biden than to say a prayer. We live in a democracy, again, as imperfect as it may be, and we need to constantly contact our elected officials and remind them that this is an important issue. I know, I've spoken to some officials who were running for office in this past election, and to see where on their radar Ukraine was, and it's some people feel strongly about it, but it's not necessarily how we base our vote. And it is kind of confusing to Ukrainians because they go like, what role is Ukraine playing in American politics? I'm saying hopefully none, because we don't want Ukraine to be politicized. We don't want Ukraine to be the Republican or Democratic war. It is something that United States is helping a democracy survive, and regain its sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I think we just need to provide pressure on our politicians in the way that is most suitable to us, for the help that is more suitable to us. Because you're right, there's humanitarian help, but there's also military aid, and I think that it's perfectly okay. There's different account numbers that Ukraine has for those that want to donate for humanitarian aid versus those that want to help towards weapons. I think that, it's a free society, and we can do different things. We can make those choices, but providing pressure and applying pressure on our elected officials and speaking out about this, even having those Ukrainian flags, it's just all of it adds together, and it keeps the issue up front. And I think that's where news media has been so crucial, and all the YouTube channels that are out there, because they show a picture, with all due respect to the wonderful medium of radio that we're utilizing right now, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so seeing those images, seeing how brutal Russia is, and I know, from reading that we are not trying to start World War III. We're trying to avoid a nuclear conflict with Russia. Those are really important things. We don't want to have a World War III. And that's why that's a lot of difficult decisions on the Biden administration of how to provide help for Ukraine and not trigger that kind of escalation. Perhaps a greater humanitarian aid is absolutely part of it. Thank you for your call, Nina. And we have one more call in just a few minutes. So, Steve, go ahead. Welcome to the program.
Yeah, Mr. Rashkin, just a couple of quick comments. I assert that it is contrary to American interests to provoke the only great power, namely Russia, that has the ability to decimate us, but it is in the interests of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon to extend its markets to Eastern Europe, resulting in the destabilization of yet another world region. And I'd also like to point out the irony of talking about spreading democracy abroad when we're witnessing its terminal erosion here in the U.S. Thank you.
Wow, those are really great points. Okay, I'm going to address them very quickly because we have just a couple of minutes left. First of all, I completely agree with you. I am the last person to want to see a huge revival of the military-industrial complex. It was kind of not doing, too much, and that's great. But the reality is that it's there for a reason, and we need to protect ourselves against the greatest threat to us right now. Long term, it's China, but right now, it's Russia. And so I think that Lockheed Martin and the rest of them, we need to not be afraid of them just because they do what they do. They provide very valuable right now. So time and place matters, and right now we need them. And as far as elections, yes. And in fact, Vladimir Putin's hope is that Republicans are going to start putting, as they say, sticks and wheels and brakes on Biden agenda and will limit ability to vote. We know, 57 Republican congressmen, congresswomen that voted against the latest package for Ukraine. Those are real people. And we know that in Kremlin, they know, and they're expecting, the same way that Trump is controlling Republican Party, that even though most Republicans support Ukraine, we see more and more Republican politicians that opposed help to Ukraine. Even there's a congresswoman in Indiana, Victoria Sparks, who was born in Ukraine, and she was originally all in favor, and she was even critical of Biden for not providing enough support. But then she changed her tune because she's a Republican politician. It is really sad to watch, and we have to understand that there's a connection, and it's not like implicit, it's pretty explicit. So I guess that's my answer to how we're all interconnected. The problem with Russia and nuclear weapons is that even if they use nuclear weapons in a terrible way and just end up bombing themselves, we still could be dealing with the effects of this because we're on the same planet. No matter how far Russia may seem from us at any particular point, we're still on the same planet, and those things affect all of us. So I think that would be a good place to wrap up. I really want to thank everyone at WORT who given me this wonderful, unique opportunity to share with you, and thank Jade and Chuck and Shali for being awesome producers and engineer. And I want to thank all the listeners and callers. It really helps me to understand better the issues that are important to you as I go and speak on Ukrainian TV about what Americans think. It's really, really helpful. So I want to thank everyone that's been involved in this, and wish you all a wonderful, wonderful Thursday and a great, happy holiday season. Thank you so much, and my name is Yuri Rashkin. Take care. Is Slava Ukraini.
We come and listen and support it. Live and direct, we come and never be recorded. With information that would never be reported. Disregard the mainstream, media distorted. We come and listen and support it. Live and direct, we come and never be recorded. With information that would never be reported. Disregard the mainstream, media distorted. We come and listen and support it. 6'6" above sea level. I grab the mic because I like to take it to another mental level. 6'6" above sea level. I grab the mic because I like to take you to another mental level. 6'6" above sea level. I grab the mic because I like to take you to another mental level. 6'6" above sea level. I grab the mic because I like to take you to another